The U.S. armed forces settled in Guantanamo Bay at the end of the 19th century, but the territory officially came under direct U.S. control in 1903. According to the treaty, Cuba leased the territory for 2,000 gold pesos a year for an indefinite period. 30 years later, when Fulgencio Batista came to power in Cuba, the agreement was revised. The lease price was set at $4,000 per year, and termination of the agreement was only possible with the consent of both parties. After the revolution, the new Cuban authorities tried to take control of Guantanamo Bay, but were unable to do so. Washington paid the rent regularly, even though the Cuban authorities stopped cashing the checks back in 1959. For many decades, the military base at Guantanamo remained an outpost of the U.S. Army in the Caribbean. American soldiers learned to coexist peacefully with the local population, despite the hostile political situation. With the end of the Cold War, the base lost its significance, and in the early 1990s, it was mostly used to house refugees from Cuba and Haiti. However, the conditions there were so harsh and inhumane that in 1993, human rights activists succeeded in getting the United States to transport them to other locations. For 10 years, the public forgot about the Guantanamo base, whose real history began after September 11. After the terrorist attack, the United States declared war on international terrorism and needed to find a place to detain everyone who was involved in terrorism in one way or another. The Guantanamo base was ideal for this purpose, as it is located outside official jurisdictions, and virtually anything can be done to prisoners there. The first prisoners arrived at the military base in January 2002. These 20 people were brought from Afghanistan, where they had been captured during secret operations. They were accused of participating in hostilities on the side of Islamic extremists, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Their names were not disclosed, and their arrests were not publicized and were kept secret from the public. By that time, the military had not yet finished building the barracks, so the first prisoners had to be placed in outdoor cages. Soon, prisoners from other countries began to be brought to Guantanamo, mainly from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Anyone whom intelligence or military officials considered to be international terrorists or their accomplices was brought there. By 2003, the prison had grown to include barracks, a library, and interrogation rooms. A Guantanamo prison cell is a tiny room with a small bed and a toilet or a hole in the floor. The only belongings allowed are clothing and personal hygiene items. Once a day, prisoners are taken out for an hour-long walk, unless they have been punished for misconduct. The rest of the time is spent being interrogated and tortured. The first high-profile scandals involving human rights violations erupted just 2 years later. It turned out that Guantanamo guards were given memos describing enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, various forms of strangulation, instructions on methodical psychological harassment, and insults based on nationality or religion. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for weeks without being told what time of day or day of the week it was. They were beaten several times a day. Guantanamo practiced an individual approach. Depending on the type of personality, different methods of torture were used on prisoners. The most devout were thrown spoiled religious books into their cells, while the most aggressive were humiliated and photographed. When a prisoner began to hallucinate, the guards simply played along, driving their victims to complete madness. These methods have been fully approved by the U.S. Department of Defense. Washington responds to accusations of human rights violations and violations of the Geneva Convention by saying that terrorists are not soldiers in the regular army of any country, and therefore, the rules governing the treatment of prisoners of war do not apply to them. Located in Cuba, the Guantanamo base falls outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law. The military has even managed to challenge the prisoner's right to be physically present in court. Guantanamo detainees are tried only by special commissions of the Department of Defense, and in many cases, the defendants are not charged for years. A congressional investigation initiated in 2006 showed that torture is not very effective, as the information obtained in this way cannot be verified for accuracy. Guards often got exactly what they wanted to hear. George Bush defended the CIA and the military until his last days as U.S. president. He said, "We must be confident that our intelligence has all the tools it needs civilians in this war. Nevertheless, the scale of the abuses at Guantanamo shocked American society to such an extent that many people began to demand that the base be disbanded. At the same time, reports of torture at Guantanamo Bay sparked a wave of anti-American sentiment in Europe and the Middle East and gave radical Islamists yet another reason to join terrorist organizations. Those released from this prison also do not harbor any love for Washington and sometimes join terrorists. President Barack Obama attempted to close the prison in 2009. The plan was to transfer the prisoners to prisons in the US or to other countries. However, Congress prohibited the use of federal funds to transport prisoners, effectively halting the closure process. However, Obama managed to significantly reduce the number of prisoners. In 2009, there were about 200 prisoners, and by 2017, the number had fallen to about 40. In 2018, when Donald Trump became president, he rescinded Obama's order to close the prison, but did not increase the number of prisoners. During Joe Biden's presidency, the Pentagon and the State Department were instructed to close Guantanamo by the end of his term, but this did not happen. However, the number of prisoners was reduced to a historic low of 15. In 2015, the book Guantanamo Diary was published, written by former prisoner Mohamedou Ould Slahi, who spent 14 years in captivity and was released in 2016 after the book was published. In 2021, it was adapted into the Hollywood film The Mauritanian, which tells the story of the horrors experienced by Guantanamo prisoners. The film is clearly intended to tug at viewers' heartstrings and sway American public opinion in favor of the immediate closure of the prison. The main argument of those in favor of closing Guantanamo is that prisoners have not been charged for years. But the truth is that the US government is well aware that many people in the prison are only indirectly linked to terrorist groups. The purpose of Guantanamo is not to punish them, but to extract information that is important to the special services. To better understand the agent's motivation, I recommend watching an excerpt from the film Sicario, Day of the Soldado, in which Josh Brolin's character interrogates a young Somali pirate to get important, albeit indirect, information about the Kansas City terrorist attack. The African man himself is not involved in the case, but he knows one detail that is very important to the CIA, and to find it out, the agent is willing not only to torture, but also to kill this man's entire family. Is this immoral? Of course, but the American authorities and special services owe nothing to people from Africa, the Middle East, or other regions. They are obliged to protect security within the United States and are prepared to use any methods and means to do so. This is precisely why the Guantanamo prison is needed, so that the CIA and the military can obtain necessary information in a special place where no laws will interfere with them. The story of Mohamedou Ould Slahi confirms this. He himself was not involved in terrorism, according to public information, but his cousin was Osama bin Laden's right-hand man. Therefore, Mohamedou could be used for information, blackmail, or exchange. And if you think that only the United States organizes torture prisons, you are mistaken. There are similar places in Israel, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, not to mention China or Russia. I guess the Guantanamo prison will continue to operate for many years to come, even if it holds only a small number of prisoners. Unfortunately, something may happen one day that will make such a place very useful, and it is up to each individual to decide how ethical or effective it is to use Guantanamo or other similar prisons. Share your thoughts in the comments.